Nice to meet you, everyone. Super excited to be here.
Wow.
I'm a huge coffee geek, actually, and it turns out that this city has probably the best coffee places I've ever been in the world. Seriously, it's great. So let's start. One of the most iconic movie openings of all time, and it never fails to get our attention. Good morning, everyone. Super excited to be here with you guys today. And so the sad news is we're not going to watch Lion King today here, but we're going to talk a little bit about the role of attention in design. So what is worth your attention? I feel like today we have to be more selective than ever in how we spend our time and what we spend our time working on, because ultimately, the way you spend your attention shapes your successes, your failures, your happiness, and perhaps even more importantly, who you are. And at the core of this lies this very question here. Why should anyone care? Why should anyone, including you, care about anything? Now, Seth Godin aptly notes that no one stops to take a picture of a cow. But what if that cow was purple? It would make it a remarkable cow. It would be a cow worth of your attention, right? Now, the problem is that most people think that only a certain category of product can be remarkable. But that's not true. Toilet paper is not remarkable, but black toilet paper is. In fact, I invite you to try it when you have friends over, and I guarantee you that it will not just notice it, but they'll also talk about it. And that's precisely the point. We're in the attention game, and I feel like our time is running out. We're no longer just designing for experience, but for attention. And I'm not talking about necessarily just attention of users, but perhaps even more importantly about the attention of the people we work with. Because without their support, without their commitment, and without their specific skills, your ideas are not going to happen no matter how good they are. So today I'd like to talk about 3 products I've worked on, both as an independent designer and also during my time at Google, and talk a little bit about the things I've learned and the role that attention played in it. So the first one is called Mindful. Now, I've always been obsessed with text editing interfaces. And so Mindful is a project that I launched 2 years ago, and it's based on a text editor that a friend and me developed called FrontKit. And FrontKit was really supposed to change, to be a new way to create content on the web in a really, really fluid way. And I had really high aspirations for it. I really wanted this to be the most fluid writing experience that I've ever used. And so one of the things that I was really excited about was what I called the flow menu. Now, the flow menu, one of the things I realized just from observing people, like whether it's on the bus or whether they're typing on their laptops, is that no one ever stops a new line with a space. And that's a shame, because the space key is a huge key, right? The space key is a key that deserves to be tapped. It's fun to tap on the space key. It's one of the biggest keys on the keyboard. But unfortunately, it isn't quite useful in a new line. So that's where this idea came in, that you have this contextual menu that basically always adapts to where you are in a document, and then you eject the UI components that make sense in that context. But the funny part was that this, even though that was UI sugar, was actually not the hard part about the project. The hardest part was really to get the basics right. So the problem I had is that the cursor often jumped to weird random locations in the document. And at some point, I started to get nightmares about cursors. You know, like if you work on a text editor at 1 in the morning, it's very likely that you get nightmares about these text cursors following you, because the problem is that it's also not a very gratifying thing to work on, unlike what I've just showed you before. Because no one will ever look at their screens and say, I just love how that text editor always sits in the right spot. No one ever said that, right? And so after some point, it got really bad. I yelled at my computer. Once I had a beard, and it got better. But still, if you have family and kids, don't create an editor. Just don't. So after 9 months, I finally started to get somewhere, and I showed it to a friend, and he got really excited when he started playing around with it. And he said that it was a really nice writing experience. And then he asked me, but what's the product? And then I said, what do you mean? And then he said, well, you said that you had a product that you wanted to show me. And then I said, no, but it's right there. You're using it right now. And then he said, no, that's not a product. That's an editor. And that's when it hit me. And because I knew he was right, and I hate when that particular friend is right. But he was right. Indeed, the text editor itself is very rarely the product. So after that, I needed a long break. I also couldn't pay my bills anymore, so I started working on other stuff. And I had this insight that really helped when I started working on conversational interfaces. Now, the promise of conversational interfaces, really apart from natural language as an interface, is that idea of bringing the value to where people already are, right? So instead, like if you want to get a boarding pass, instead of downloading an app or instead of going to their website, instead of like creating an account, you can just text that bot to text a bot on Facebook, for instance, if you're on Facebook, or use the channels of your choice. And that's a big promise. So I wondered, what if I applied the same concept to a text editing interface? Because what's the problem of note-taking, really? One of the biggest problems of note-taking in one simple sentence is this. The only notes you remember are the ones you see. So I wondered, what if your notes were where you already are? Now, most people that I work with spend a lot of time in their browsers during the day. So what if in every new tab, your notes were already there, so that through repetitive exposure, you wouldn't just be more conscious about your notes, but also more mindful about the things that are going on your mind. And that's how Mindful was born. So I made a short video here that I'm going to play real quick. So as you can see, it also comes with the obnoxious Silicon Valley soundtrack that is almost a must by now. So what happened after that? So when I posted that to Vimeo, it took like a week, and it was featured on Product Hunt, it was featured on Google Chrome Store, and I was super excited. I was really, really excited. And perhaps a little too excited, because 1 week later I released an update because I wanted to do a good job with this product and evolve it further. And the next morning when I woke up, I had 100 notifications on Twitter with people saying, oh my God, Adrian, I lost my notes. I have a really important meeting. Where are my notes? I'm meeting the VP in the afternoon. Where are my notes? And that was probably the most traumatizing experience I had in product design. It turns out that people are really attached to their notes. I even got an email from the director of design at Microsoft who said, by the way, the product worked great for the 1 week it worked. So it took me quite some time. I literally stayed up like 4 nights in a row to help everyone recover their notes. But that's like a big deal, you know, like because when you launch something yourself or in a small team, it's fundamentally different than like being in a big team, because you feel personally responsible for the pain that you've caused to these people. But anyways, the takeaway here for me is this. What's the product? It's a very simple question, but sometimes the product we're building is fundamentally different from what we're actually building. I almost ended up throwing away a year of work. This entire front kit thing that I've built, almost an entire year just went into the trash bin. And so for the longest time, I thought I was building a text editor until I wasn't. I was building a notepad that follows you throughout your day. And that message resonated with people. And so once your product, once your idea finds its unique purpose, its unique voice, it doesn't just help you get more clarity about the intention of what you're actually building, but also to get people's attention as well. I think Steve Jobs actually said it quite succinctly when he said, you have to start with the customer experience and work your way back to the technology. And I knew that quote back then, but I still made that simple mistake, because FrontKit was the technology, but Mindful was the product. All right, so this is the second one. So 2016 was a crazy year where everyone, literally everyone, was talking about conversational UI. And so one morning I woke up and asked this question on LinkedIn. What's your plan after chatbots take over and designers are no longer needed? And that was a bit of an ironic question, but one of the product directors at Google had a pretty straightforward response. Now, that response was hopefully as ironic as my question, but you know deep down, like when someone makes a joke, but you still feel like deep down that it hits a nerve. That's pretty much how that felt like. So rather than being scared, I decided to make an experiment, and I turned my website into a chatbot. This is how it looks like. So if you go to my website, rather than a normal navigation, you actually can navigate through conversation. And it says scroll if you don't feel like talking. So if you don't scroll, it starts talking to you. And the bot then basically starts to introduce myself and stuff, and you can basically have an ongoing conversation with my website. Now, the response here was really fascinating. I received over 300 emails within the first 24 hours of launching the experiment, and I was really excited. But I also wanted to understand why. Like, why did anyone care about this? Why did anyone pay attention to this? And because undoubtedly, I think timing was a huge factor. If I had launched this just 1 year earlier, or even 1 year later, even today, I think no one would have cared. So timing was a big deal, for sure. But using Twitter, I was able to pinpoint it to a few other things that people seem to really enjoy. And one of the first things was motion. So animation in this case wasn't just a way to enhance the experience, it was really a quintessential part of it. I spent hours, if not days, refining the motion curve, how these chat bubbles enter the screens, like the velocity, the speeds, the typing duration. And this is, in fact, something that I'm super obsessed about, in how people perceive time. Because the way we design with time when it comes to interaction is basically by using motion. And it's so subtle and so elusive that we rarely understand how time affects our interpretation. So let me just give you a simple example real quick. Imagine you just met someone you really like. And now, after that, you send something like this. Hey, Anna, it was really nice to meet you, Bob. Not the most creative message, but it gets the job done, right? Now, think about it. Which type should you send this message immediately, just after meeting Anna, or should you wait for a little bit? And now think about it for yourself. What would you prefer? Now, most people say that they would prefer the immediate response because it gives you a sense of clarity, it gives you a sense of assurance. But just waiting a little bit creates a far more powerful emotional response. It results in anticipation. And that's what I call like the conversational momentum, how we go through different stages in our conversation, from instantaneous to typing to where we have short interruptions and to actually breaking up. So it's almost like a way to add white space, mental white space to our designs, to slow down the user experience, to make people feel more, to make the experience more deliberate, but also make the content more digestible. So let's look at the instantaneous segment real quick. So the instantaneous segment is really, what was really interesting is that someone who worked on a support hotline told me, so he works with a chat interface to help people who have computer issues. And they have these pre-scripted responses that he can use in order to greet people. So when he gets connected to a new customer, he can say like, hey, it's great to meet you, variable for the name. So it's great to meet you, Jake. But it turns out that he never uses those pre-canned responses, because he told me that when he does, people immediately think they're talking to a bot. So just slightly waiting a little bit and actually having typing makes just completely change the interpretation. And that's where we go to the dynamic delay, which I think is really interesting, because typing adds a lot of dynamics to the way we converse with an interface, right? Because in an interface where so many social cues are stripped away, every small detail really matters. So in this case, let's take for another example. Let's go back to the Anna and Bob example. Now let's say Bob asks Anna in a text messaging app, hey Anna, should we go out tonight? And then he sees the typing indicator, Anna is typing, typing indicator goes away, typing indicator comes back, And then she says, sure. So how sure is Anna really now, right? We don't really know. And that's kind of like the point that just by playing with time, we can introduce a lot of really interesting psychological concepts like hesitations, uncertainty. All of these things would be completely lost without typing indicators. And so what's great about this in general is that by using motion, it also keeps people hooked. It also keeps people focused on what's happening, whereas if it's static, it's completely unnatural. And I had this crazy experience that like some people actually thought they were talking to the real me. And then when I met them in the real life, they said, but we already had a chat. And I said, no, probably not. So personality is another part. So personality here is really about, I feel like products need an opinion. And sometimes it can be hard to build things that have their own opinions. But in this case, it was simpler because it was my own bot. So what happened was that a lot of people started spamming my website. And a lot of people wanted to talk about naughty things, which is a problem with spam in general. So I had to install a spam protection. And what happened here is when people get in touch or something, or they want to send me an email and they say something like, you suck, then the chatbot will basically say, your email reminds me of the poop emoji. Or it will just like, I have like tons of like different canned responses that it will react to, just to show people that if you're messing around with my interface, I'm going to mess around with you, you know? And that, I feel like that's like one of the unique things, because it almost creates this shared intimate moment between you and the user that people don't often get when it comes to experiences. And the other one was that it's contextual. So the very simple question I ask myself is, if you're going to a cocktail party, and you know that most people at this cocktail party are designers, does it affect the way you open up a conversation? For most people, the answer would be a resounding yes, right? If you go to a developers conference, you just have to say, hey, try the new React, and voila, you have some friends. Super easy. With designers, it's a bit more intricate. But the point is simple, right? By adapting it to the context, you can make it more personal. So I wondered, how can I translate that simple idea to my chat interface? So I occasionally write about design on Medium and tweet about design on Twitter. And so when people access my website from one of the publications that I contribute to, they will get a personalized greeting. Hey, it looks like you're visiting from this. Are you interested in design? You know, so instead of just having the normal response, it would immediately change the conversational path so users would get something that feels more personalized. And like these super simple tricks, it's almost stupid. It's almost stupidly simple. But these simple changes made a huge impact. Even refreshing the website that changes what it says. You know, small little things can go a long way. And it doesn't need AI, which is great. So looking back, I feel like I learned tons of this. I learned like how to write conversation, how hard it actually is to write good conversations, how important motion is. All of these things I wouldn't have discovered if it wasn't for experimentation. The last part actually was also really interesting, is how little you need to do in order for people to perceive an intelligence. There's this famous example where people are shown an animation of rectangles and circles and objects flying around the scene. And then they asked participants in the study, what do you see? And the people who did the research, they expected the participants to tell them that they just see random objects flying around the screen, but that's not what they saw. They said things like, that rectangle is really mean, man. Like, why is he always hunting the circle? And what's wrong with the circle anyways? Is you have like, so like it's very, very little things. As soon as motion gets into play, it changes interpretation. So a few weeks later, I decided to launch another experiment based on this. And the idea this time was slightly different. The idea was to talk about conversational UX, like about UX news happening in the community, and get your updates in a conversational way. So instead of talking to me, users would now talk to a bear. And this didn't work out quite as well. So in this case, bonjour, François. How would you describe the term bot to your grandma? My grandma is dead. All right, thanks for your feedback. So much work went into this. And this was still one of the most screenshotted and tweeted interactions. It just shows that scaling conversational design is very hard. And I wasn't even using AI in this example, so you can just imagine how much more complicated it gets. But the takeaway here really is that we need to start experimenting. We can read tons of Medium's articles and books about design, but I feel like the best way to learn is still to get your hands dirty and start doing something. Because the beauty of experimentation is really that it immediately shows you your weaknesses. Because when you start, you probably don't know anything. But then you realize that you catch on certain things much faster than others. And that helps you identify those weaknesses and be much more, much faster in how you can fill those gaps. And the great thing about experimentation, really, is that if you're lucky, it's not just an opportunity to grow, but it's also a really unique way to get people's attention as well. All right, so let's talk about the last project, which is Google Lens. I have quite some friends who work in big organizations, and one of the common thing that I hear, which I think is hard sometimes, is like, how can you make sure that your ideas don't die? Like, a lot of people have good ideas, but then they're worried that they will just not be heard. In fact, one of my biggest worry when joining Google was that I would just be like a cogwheel in this huge machine. And so I was very lucky because I think this project showed me that this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But let's take a step back first. 2 years ago, Google announced that it's no longer a mobile-first company, but an AI-first one instead. And they really have come a long way in implementing AI in some of their core products, most notably in Google Photos, Google Translate, and most recently, the Google Assistant. And I feel like the Google brand has become one of the most expressive brands out there through its motion-based system. And as you can see, it's clearly all about the dots. Now, the dots can shape into different objects, into different states and entities. It's almost like the body language of Google. And they also clearly show that voice is a big part of the Google story. In fact, not surprisingly, 20% of all search traffic from mobile comes from voice. And what's interesting is that over the years, the way people asked questions slowly became more and more conversational, which led to the most recent shape of the dots, the Google Assistant. Now, the Google Assistant is the best way to have a conversation with Google and get things done. Because unlike traditional UI, it doesn't rely on you understanding how the interface works, but through the power of natural language, you can just talk and the way you're used to. Now, through deep learning, Google was able to remove ambient noises, and we heard this accent story just before in the elevator. And there's also a neural net that specifically removes accent, and so the algorithm now has almost human, on par with human level understanding. At the same time, huge strides were being made in image recognition. And in just 6 months, the team added its new image recognition system to the Photos experience, and this allowed, for the first time, for users to search their photos with more intricate concepts, such as my happy parents, or parents smiling, or crowd, and stuff like this, which was previously not possible. And this added tremendous value to the Photos experience. Now, of course, it's still not perfect. We're still trying to make the difference between puppies and chicken nuggets, but we're getting there. In fact, this can sometimes be a little bit like a maze, So I've been working on the Lens project for a while, and designing for image processing is really hard because we have this one really weird case where, when I look at my laptop like this, it's pretty clear to me that this is my laptop. And when I change angles, it still is my laptop. But that's not how a machine thinks about the world. And so we had this weird case where from this angle, it would be my laptop, but from this angle, it would be a museum in Baltimore. And then we were like, wait, how is that possible? What's happening here? And it turns out that one of the photos that was used to teach the system it was in the Museum of Baltimore, so the GPS tag was applied. But in the museum, there was a MacBook Pro. And so the algorithm assumed that it was a MacBook, like a museum. So it took a while to fix. But anyways, based on this technology, we basically asked ourselves, what if the Google Assistant could see? And what if we combine visual, like understanding vision and machine learning with the power of natural language? And so we let those ideas dance for a little bit, and it turns out that the most natural answer to that was Google Lens. Now, Google Lens is really a natural extension of the Google system. Google can now listen, speak, think, hear, and most recently, see. And you don't want to know how much time it took to animate, animate these dots. Anyways, we presented a sneak peek of this at Google I/O 2 years ago, and the reaction was really, really exciting. Like, people seemed really excited, but it took time to build that excitement internally, even in the teams, you know? And I feel like from the assistant side, a lot of it came down to one of the projects I've worked on with my team. And after tons of discussions and brainstormings with some of the best people I've ever worked with, I started working on this prototype. And the result of this was this video that I'm going to show you. So this was recorded at a library, and what you can see here is really the assistant interface. So you have like the assistant telling you, hey, how can I help? There's the voice button, and there's the camera button. Now what happens in this case is that the user taps on the camera, it opens the camera, you tap on this book, it extracts the entities that it discovered, and now you get the offer back about that specific book. Now what's so powerful about this is that you can think of image as an input mechanism, right? Now you have the offer, but now you can ask follow-on questions. You can ask things like, where was he born? Or you can ask things like, what other books have you written? Give me recommendations. And this makes it like a really nice shortcut to get information, because sometimes it can be really hard to describe something. If you've seen a nice chair at a friend's place, like, good luck describing that in words, right? So it's going to be much faster if you can just talk about it, show it as a visual interface. And so that was really exciting. And there was one person in that meeting where we showed it who said, well, that's great, guys. So when can we ship it? When can we do this? And then we said, well, we're working on it. Little did some people know that we weren't quite that far yet in the process. But it still helped. That got us into a bit of trouble later. But it still helped to create this shared vision, right? And that's precisely the point. My takeaway here is really that we need to create a shared vision. We have to find a way to express an idea, the ideas that people have in their heads, and visualize those. Because if you think about it, it's almost like the superpowers that you have as a designer is really to get things that people have in their heads out there so that you can look at it. And you shouldn't also be afraid to ask for help if it involves skills that you don't have yet. In fact, you should ask for help no matter what. Because once you ask for help, you're no longer just a lonely designer trying to prove a point, but you're now like a group of people working towards the same goal. So I just want to recap here real quick. We started by talking about what's the product. This really simple question, and yet super critical, and how it forces us to frame a product in a way that people can relate to. The other one was the idea of keeping experimentation going, no matter how far you are in your career process. And the last part we talked about is to create a shared vision, to use the unique strength we have as designer to visualize ideas that people have in their heads. So one last thought, ideas are cheap, and in order to create something original, it's not enough to have great ideas. We need to find original ways to make them happen. So I'd like to close with this one last story. Now, The Lion King really is one of my favorite movies of all time, but what most people don't know is that the Lion King movie was almost not made. In fact, for Disney, it was considered a B movie because it didn't have any humans in it. So there was this discussion about whether they should actually progress and make the movie happen, and there was a huge debate until someone cut through the room and said, "Wait, that's Hamlet." And then silence, and then the guy says, "Wait, uncle kills father, son needs to remember who he is and revenge his father." everyone immediately understood the story. It went on and changed the childhoods of millions of kids out there, including mine. So, I feel like sometimes that's the power of attention, and how I think sometimes it's not enough to have these good ideas, but sometimes we have to direct attention and be in the room and be present and add to the mix to make the ideas we care about happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. Okay, got some questions for you, and they're just starting to come in. So let's just start with the tools question. What tools did you use to build the chatbot on your site?
None, actually.
None.
I programmed all of this manually.
Yeah.
But I'm still thinking about releasing that as a framework. But because I actually expected that there's way more frameworks available, but it turns out that there's not really that many. Yeah.
Opportunity alert. So there's some things about AI generally, and there's kind of a cluster of questions. So one of them is, what's the biggest challenge that you face or you see as a designer when you're working with AI?
So the problem with AI is that its unpredictability is a huge problem. And I think Andy Bob said it best, that great designers, they ask all the questions and understand all the problems before. Mm-hmm. Like the really great designers, they are comfortable with a certain level of ambiguity and uncertainty, and they can navigate this space. So for me, one of the hardest part is really when it comes to design is like, in traditional UI design, you have a flow in Sketch, perhaps, where you go from left to right. You go through that flow. But with AI-enabled use cases, there is no linearity in the experience anymore. Right. So often it can go through various different places, and so it becomes really hard from an interaction design point of view to consider all these microstates that the experience can be in, and then how you map it back to make sure that the experience is always stable. Right? So that's, I feel like, is one of the hardest part to work with AI.
So iteration becomes really important in that, like patterns and being willing to just kind of always have to pivoting. That's what I hear as you're moving with it. So actually, kind of along the lines of, hang on one second. Along the lines of, you showed the photo with the puppies and the fried chicken.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of, the question is, what's the role of bias and diversity in developing these systems?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a huge topic, and I'm speaking here on behalf of myself. Okay. I do not represent Google. But I think what's hard is that like when you think about machines, you think that they're like almost like a different existential thing that has perfect reasoning and everything. But everything that these machines do is based on what we teach them. Like all the books that you use for Google Translate, for instance, right? They're all books written by humans. So all the biases that are included in human history are automatically included in Translate as well. And it's a problem in all the products that happen that rely on machine learning, right? And so these biases are, funnily enough, not a reflection of technology, but a reflection of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that's, and I think the hard part is, it raises new ethical questions because we see that democracy is a hard process, right? And so what is the right answer when you ask certain questions that are politically difficult to answer? How do you react to those? Can you give a good answer, or are you just really defensive and then say, sorry, I don't know how to answer that, And so that's a hard question, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it might
problem,
be.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question because I do think it's looking. This is a technology that really clearly reflects what's going on in the human landscape. That's what. So it's actually kind of along these lines. There's a question about if you're kind of in an experimental mindset, how can you make sure the AI doesn't make mistakes that offend people, like, for example, your grandmother?
So that's where it becomes really hard, right?
Yeah.
So that's where you have to decide. So let's imagine you build a chatbot for yourself. I think that will help to show up the problem. So the conflict is really how valuable to you is personality versus always being in the safe zone. Because if you have personality, like the more personality you have, we saw that poop emoji in my presentation, the more personality you have, the more potentially amazing moments you create for a few people, but potentially really bad situations for some other people, right? And that's where one of the problems you have is really how, like, that's something that only you can decide, because there's no way that you can create a perfect experience. That's one of the things that you need to get comfortable with. You need to be able to learn how to deal with setbacks. You need to be able to react to the fact that you might not understand the current context and keep the conversation going. So I think a lot of it comes really down to personal like taste. In my case, it was easy because I was just representing myself. Right. So if I pissed off someone on the other side of the planet, it's probably not a big deal, right? But if you have a company behind it, then it's a fundamentally different issue. And that's also why many of the products that large companies create, like they sometimes seem a little bit dull, but that's really a result of that process, right? Yeah.
Okay, let's see. So when you were working on Google Lens, how much time do you spend designing screens versus talking to developers, data scientists, folks like that?
I think it's probably 50-50, I would say. I think some of the screens I worked on took a lot of time. But with Lens, I think what was really interesting was really to understand all these intricacies, of technology. Like, I had no idea why this Baltimore example happened, right, for instance. And so, like, on understanding this, really, you can only understand this by talking to the engineers. And I think what's interesting is some office cultures, that's where we get to go a bit deep. But I think what's interesting is where you're sitting is really important. Because some people, like some design teams, they sit not in the same room that the engineers sit in. And I really believe that it is one of the most important things that you sit with the engineers. Because like these small questions and conversations that happen in the same room, you will miss all of these details that actually help you understand, like the serendipitous discoveries, you make along the way. And you're missing out on all of that if you're just always circulating with the same people, with the same group.
Yeah. So. And there's actually something really interesting about when you separate people. Humans are naturally tribal. And it takes that long to set up tribes. So if you put a physical barrier between people, they will tribalize. And then we've got designers versus engineers. Should designers code? Should coders learn UX? It's like it exacerbates all of those things. So
Exactly.
Okay, here's one. Whatever happened to Google Glass?
To Google Glass? It's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
Someone got beat up in a bar, and then that was the end of that. Right?
I think that was pretty much the end of it.
So let's see. So I'm going to try to interpret this one. So 20% of all search is voice, or 20% of all kinds of interactions on mobile are voice. So understanding the difference is very important, not to mislead marketers.
Right. So the way I understand the statistics is that it's search.
Right. Okay.
That it's search queries, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with the sentiment, but from the statistics that I have, it's voice searches.
Voice searches, not not on mobile. Let's see. When is Google going to give visibility on search volume around voice queries like it does for keywords? He's like, dude. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm asking
No, it's fine.
one more.
It's fine.
And it's also
just Google questions in general are hard, right?
Yeah, because I was just going to say, I have empathy for this because people ask me all kinds of IBM questions. Do not ask me what Watson does. Okay, ask those guys out there. Okay, so how far are we from general intelligence?
Okay, so that's a great question.
Yeah,
I love that.
A little more like okay.
I love that one. So I'm a huge fan of Ex Machina. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie. It's a beautiful movie where an AI takes over and kills everyone. I've seen Terminator. That guy also kills everyone. Yeah. Actually, Skynet does. But so we're still, like, when you actually work with people who are working on AI stuff, I've never seen anyone who is even remotely worried that, except for Elon Musk, but I haven't met him. Right. Who's remotely worried that the general AI is in the making, or that the general AI will soon come. Because like one of the things I realized when it comes to visual like based algorithms and voice and stuff, like some of these things are still so hard to get right that it becomes very hard to imagine a future anytime soon where we have a general intelligence. I mean, of course, like one of the things that is hard for the human brain to imagine is exponential growth, right? So we have to take that into account, which I do, because I really do think like nothing I've seen in this space yet really makes me believe that we're going to have a general AI soon. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Adrian Zumbrunnen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.